I think it's important to say this is also a European genocide. What Israel is doing in Palestine could not happen without the active support of both the United States and Europe. Then there would be, let's say, what some people call the radical left. I would call them the authentic left, but all right, that's a matter of debate. When a school is bombed in Ukraine, and this is horrible, of course, when it happens, it gets a lot of attention, and rightly so, because it shouldn't happen. But when Palestinian schools, hospitals, journalists are assassinated, executed, sometimes at really a point-blank range, this is downplayed. It's like Palestinians are not even considered full humans by the EU establishment. It's horrible, like the arrogance against the working class, the fact that there's no respect for people that are fighting for their salaries, for their wages, but also no respect at all for people from the global south. Actually, as members of the European Parliament, we're supposed to be propagandists for the European project, right? We're supposed to go out there and explain how wonderful Europe is, and then we're really
You're doing a terrible job, Marc.
I'm not very good at it.
Hello, everyone. I'm Rania Khalek, and this is Dispatches. Across Europe, the far right is gaining ground. Authoritarianism is rising. But instead of resisting, many European leaders are locking arms with empire, cheerleading NATO's wars, deepening economic submission to the US, and backing Israel's genocide in Gaza. Europe was never innocent. It's the original colonial power center, the model of imperial domination that the US inherited and refined. But today, rather than leading, Europe is following Washington's playbook, even when it undermines its own people. And as the continent drifts further right, the space for dissent and internationalist politics is shrinking. Marc Botenga is a Belgian member of the European Parliament and a leader in the Workers Party of Belgium. He's one of the few voices in Brussels calling for peace in Ukraine, resisting US domination, and defending Palestinian life without apology. At a time when certain segments of the European left are abandoning anti-imperialism, Botenga is holding the line and fighting to rebuild a principled resistance from within and outside of the halls of power. I spoke to him about Europe's role in the global order, the collapse of certain left parties across the continent, the importance of continuing to build and maintain hope, and what it means to be a dissident inside the EU Parliament. But before we jump into it, this is just part of this conversation. To access the full interview and support independent journalism that challenges mainstream narratives, become a Breakthrough News member at patreon.com/breakthroughnews. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this episode. Marc Botenga, welcome to Dispatches.
Thank you very much. Happy to be here.
Well, let's just jump right into it, because you're a very busy man. I thought a good place to start would be on what a lot of the news has been focusing on the last month with this insane tariff war that Trump launched across the world, but really mostly targeting China. And you have been a very vocal criticizing EU leaders for essentially turning Europe in what you call a vassal state of the US, and you've been calling for more independent trade relations that aren't basically dictated by the US. So I'm curious, what do you mean when you say that? And what would a truly sovereign European policy on this look like? How do you feel Europe should be navigating this US-China rivalry, especially as the US kicks it into high gear?
Well, I've been very critical. Why? I mean, like the US, it's not just the tariffs. Like the US basically said, we want a piece of Europe. Like we want Greenland, which is currently part of Denmark, right? And so the US administration came in saying, we want it, we're going to buy it, we might even invade it. And the reaction of European leaders was very low key. It was very much like, well, we can talk about it. The head of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, was basically kind of the EU executive, if you want. She was like, yeah, this is a transactional way of doing politics. And I'm like, they're literally saying we want part of Europe. So how can you react that softly? I mean, imagine like China or Russia would come in and would say, listen, we want a piece of Denmark, we want a piece of Germany. I mean, the reaction would be massive. And here, basically, the EU establishment was like, hey, yeah, let's talk about it. We don't like it, but let's see what we can do, right? And we've seen this also as a reaction to the tariffs, to the trade war. Basically, the EU Commission, EU governments have caved to a large extent. I mean, they've been saying, okay, well, what if we buy more US gas? Polluting, very expensive. But will you be nice to us then? Or if we get more US soybeans into our market, we're not sure if they respect our standards, but, if we do that, will you be nice to us? Or if we cut more ties with China, because China is a big concern from the US. So maybe if we cut ties with China, a little bit more, import a little bit less from China, you be nice to us? So basically, they've had this lapdog attitude towards the US. And there's no need for that. I mean, it's not good for our people. It's not good for our industries. Because obviously, I don't know, US gas, very expensive, as I said. It's not making our industries competitive. So they will potentially move away. They're going to move away. They're already moving away. Some of them potentially to the US, to Mexico. So what I've been saying is that, listen, we've got this massive change in the world that's ongoing right now, right? You've got, for the first time, basically the BRICS countries that have a higher GDP per capita than do like the traditional G7 industrialized countries, northwestern, let's say, world, the US, Europe. And so this offers opportunities, to diversify our trade relationships, not to be dependent anymore on Washington, not to be dependent anymore on the traditional, let's say, Western imperialist bloc, right? So let's look a little bit around. Let's, rather than limit ties with China, let's develop those ties. The same thing with India, South Africa, Brazil. Because basically Europe has, in my opinion, a choice now. The US are pushing for a Cold War with China, basically to kind of divide the world. You're either with us or you're with them. And Europe should really refuse that logic, that blackmail, by saying we want to have an independent course. We want to go another way. And then there's the debate, what should that course be? If we say we don't want to be a US lapdog, we don't want to follow them in all of their imperialist adventures wherever they go, Okay, so what is that policy? What's that EU policy or that European policy that should be different? And then we're looking at, first of all, let's not clone the United States. We don't need to clone the United States inside Europe. That's okay. I mean, we've got some politicians saying we should. No, really. I mean, they're saying, look at the US, they're spending so much in military. Okay, they haven't got the healthcare the people need. But I mean, they've got a big army. And we're like, no, listen, we need to invest in healthcare. We need to invest in schools. We don't need to become a US clone with 800 military bases all over the world. Europe shouldn't rule the world. Colonialist, imperialist policies, we don't need that in Europe. Let's break with those. We've had a history of colonialism, even a present policies of imperialism, but we need to break away with that. And let's look how we can look at the world differently, with respect, win-win partnership. Let's not go to Africa to steal their resources, but let's actually do, fair trade. Let's talk to other countries with respect. And, by diversifying our relations, we'll also become more, let's say, autonomous. Because the more partners you have, the less you rely on one or the other.
What you're saying sounds so logical on so many levels. But you've got this kind of like transatlantic subservience that's really deeply embedded in the European ruling class to the point where they even act against European interests. So I want you to, you've accused European leaders of essentially submitting to Trump, right? Submitting to US interests repeatedly, even when it's against those European needs that you just expressed. So I'm curious, I guess this is maybe a twofold question, but like what explains that transatlantic subservience even against Europe's own needs? And what are the consequences of that, like materially speaking, on Europe, economically, politically, militarily?
Well, I mean, how do you explain it? Obviously, there's a history to it. I mean, after the Second World War, the United States helped to reconstruct Europe, but this was done with a plan that obviously was designed to make Europe, or the West of Europe at the time, dependent on the United States, and to get the US basically in all kinds of EU, be that economic level, but also militarily, to have this cooperation at the time against the East Bloc led by the Soviet Union. But this integration, this transatlantic integration dates back from that period. Now, inside Europe, there's the idea by some in the establishment, the majority, I'd say right now, that partnering up with the United States will guarantee that they will protect us, that they will help us. Now, that is a complete, I don't know where that comes from, because the United States have always been very clear on they have interests. They don't have allies. And I know at the time there was this, I think, was it Kissinger that said that, we need to be careful not to give the impression to the world that that it's more dangerous to be an ally of the United States than to be an enemy of the United States. And I think today, actually, Europe does not they realize it, but part of it is just sold to the US establishment, let's be honest. Part of the EU politicians, I feel they're more loyal to Washington than they are to the people in Europe. So this is part of it. The second part of it is obviously that, there's a feeling that Europe should become big again, make Europe great again, but not.
No.
Yeah, and not in a good way, not in a good way. It's like, we're losing our global play, and this is true. But once again, as I said before, like we need to, and the EU establishment is kind of ruling Europe for EU multinationals. All right, let's be honest, most of them EU multinationals. So want to get influence. Some of them say, this is best to bandwagon behind US. Some others are saying, let's do that independently. We can exploit other countries independently. And at the same time exploit workers, because it's not like European workers then benefit from this. They get low salaries, increasingly bad pensions, no access to healthcare for a lot of them. Now, if you would say we want to have policies that serve the EU working class, the European working class, then you would do things differently, and you would build some kind of autonomy from the US. Now, you asked, how does that manifest today, this dependency? It's at a lot of levels. Economically, you've got US funds that are really in core sectors of the EU economy. You've got political ties, obviously, like when it came out that the US were actually spying on some European leaders, the reaction of Europe was once again very low-key. Like, if it would have been in any other country, it would have been like a revolt inside the EU establishment. And I was like, yeah, it's the US, we don't like it. But reaction very low-key, very passively. But also militarily. So we see the US are literally saying, listen, guys, you need to be more independent. We might take Greenland from you. And then you have a lot of European governments saying, we will buy more US F-35 fighter jets. Now, we know that these are controlled by the US. And that basically, I'm exaggerating a little bit, but it's enough for the US to push a button for them not to take off. So you're not going to defend your own country or your own continent against the United States with their own weapons, So what you would need would be to how do we create security? How do we create our economy? And have an industrial policy that would focus on, social development and industrial development on our continent. Now, that is not, how would I say, that's not easy, because that makes also, that forces us also to say, well, EU policy, very much market-based, very much privatization-based, very much let our multinationals take the lead, has failed. 25 years ago, they came with a big program. It's called the Lisbon Strategy, because it was done in Lisbon city in Portugal. Saying, Europe in a few years should become the most competitive and dynamic knowledge-based economy in the world. Now, 25 years later, that's a disaster. The result is not there. So we need to change policies, but that requires also tackling the power of multinational companies inside our continent. For example, energy prices, really high and really bad for the competitiveness of our industries, So let's take that into public hands. Let's say, listen, the market has not guaranteed low prices, so we will do it publicly. The people will decide on this. But this is a breakaway with the neoliberal model that's dominating and it's really pervasive throughout the European Union. And they're not ready to do this. So that's why we need to put the pressure.
And then on the war front, you have taken what should not be a controversial stance, but unfortunately, it does seem to be a controversial stance, by supporting peace efforts in Ukraine. So I'm curious if you can walk us through what has been your critique of the EU's current war footing and the alternative peace proposals that you and your party have put forward.
Yeah, I'm very happy you say they shouldn't be controversial, because indeed there's nothing controversial about it. What we have said from the beginning is that obviously this war, and this is something that is international law, is a violation of international, a violation of the UN Charter. There's no question about it. It's very clear. And most countries know this and voted to condemn this violation of territorial integrity also at the United Nations. What we were saying is that the way out is diplomacy. Of course, we spoke about the history of this. I mean, this war doesn't come from nowhere. There's been the episodes before 5 years, 2014. There's been the NATO enlargement, which we criticized, saying this is not a good idea. It will not bring peace to the continent. But once again, even mainstream politicians like former German Chancellor Angela Merkel, they knew this and they said this, they wrote this. So it's not, I mean, it's not something weird or something that comes from outer space. You know, knowing that the enlargement of NATO would create frictions. I mean, even the late Pope Francis, you know, he said, was it a good idea to go embark at the borders of Russia? And so what we were saying is two things. Basically, first, you need diplomacy to end the current war, right? We've been saying this since the start of the war and even before, right? This has always been refused by the European Union. European Union has, since the start of the war, not taken one ambitious, serious diplomatic initiative. Incredible. Like, it's about war and security on your continent, and you don't take the lead in diplomacy. And it became ridiculous. Like, at some point, we were arguing here in the European Parliament as well, like, guys, let's open, let's discuss, that doesn't mean surrender. That doesn't mean accepting everything the other guy wants or whatever. Not at all. It just means talk and negotiate. And we saw that happened. You know, we saw in Ukraine, there were negotiations on the exchange of prisoners, on nuclear security, the nuclear power plant, on the export of cereals. And so there was, how would I say, there were negotiations. And they told us, well, no, we can't negotiate now because the Russians are winning and we need to negotiate from a position of strength. And then a bit later, the Ukrainians were actually liberating some of their territory. And then they told us, no, now we're going to win militarily, so we can't negotiate. So there was no moment in time when there was like completely crazy. And in the end, what's happening now is that we have Trump and Putin negotiating in Saudi Arabia, and maybe now Zelensky and Putin in Istanbul again, on peace in Europe, without the European Union playing any role at all. So diplomatically, this is a disaster for the European Union. It's bad for Ukraine as well, because the end result will be worse now than it would have been if we would have negotiated 3 years ago. Because 3 years ago, there were peace talks in Istanbul that were basically centered around the territorial integrity of Ukraine, saying maybe it should become member of NATO, but its territorial integrity should be respected. Let's talk about the Crimea again as well. Today, the most likely outcome looks like part of it is going to stay occupied by Russia, and the other part is going to be plundered by the United States for its resources, which is the deal Trump struck with Ukraine. So basically, for Ukraine, it will be a worse deal. There's been much more destruction, many more victims than if we would have taken diplomacy seriously at the beginning. So that's part of the deal. The second thing is that we need, as Europeans and for the European working class, we need to discuss security on the European continent seriously. Like, we need to see, okay, what's the alternative? What's the long-term perspective? Okay, Russia is not going to move. Whoever is going to rule it. And we need a security order on this continent. An arms race is not a solution. Why is an arms race not a solution? Because there is this thing like, if I get more weapons, I will be more secure. The problem is that works if you're living by yourself. The problem is here, there's neighbors. No, it's true. I mean, there's neighbors. And so what's your neighbor going to do if you buy more weapons? He's going to buy more weapons. He's going to produce more weapons. And then you need to produce more weapons and innovate more, get more weapons. And this is a security dilemma, basically, where you say, well, I do something to increase my security, but basically because the other one reacts, you decreased your global security. Now, we knew this during the Cold War, during the standoff between the Western Bloc led by the United States and the Eastern Bloc of the Soviet Union. And so there was a process on the European continent of, they called it the Helsinki process, of basically saying, we need to, limit arms, we need to do arms control, get transparency so that we know who's doing what, in order to minimize the risk of conflict. And we had a number of treaties coming from that were all dismantled, or many of them were dismantled over the last years. There was even an organization coming out of that, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. Now, that organization today, that could be like one of the ways to organize security in Europe by talking to each other. Its annual budget today is inferior, is lower than what it costs, than the price of an F-22 Raptor fighter jet. So it's absolutely,
wow.
it gives you an idea.
That's a lot about priorities, yeah.
that is the priorities. And so we are saying basically these two things. You need a diplomacy, and we need a Europe that takes a diplomatic role in the world, on the one hand. And on the other hand, we need to think about, how do we want to organize security through treaties, through talks, diplomacy, and basically confidence-building measures on our continent.
If you have a conscience, it's unbearable to be plugged into the corporate media machine right now. These outlets are accomplices in genocide, running cover for the war machine. Breakthrough has become the go-to outlet for those who want something different. But the funds we've used to start this platform are starting to run out. We'd never dream of turning to mainstream corporate funding. So we're turning to you. Become a patron. For as little as $5 a month, you can become an essential part of our fight to not just break through the mainstream media, but create something that can challenge it. We have to become completely viewer-supported, or this platform we've built could go away. Don't just watch us, join us. So, Marc, I want to talk to you about Palestine, because you have been a very outspoken person on Palestine. You've been, consistently condemning Israel's genocide in Gaza. I think you're one of the only voices in the EU Parliament doing that. So can you tell our audience, what role has Europe played in enabling or legitimizing this genocide? And are you all across the European continent experiencing this same kind of attacks on free speech over the issue of Palestine that we are in the US under this guise of combating anti-Semitism?
Well, two things. First, I think it's important to say this is also a European genocide. I'm convinced that this could not happen. What is happening in Israel, what Israel is doing in Palestine could not happen without the active support of both the United States and Europe. The United States has been delivering a lot of weapons to Israel. European countries as well. Germany has even increased weapon deliveries. And at the same time, there's the economic ties. So you have the economic ties. So I think about 30% of Israel's trade in goods is with the European Union. You have public funds, research and development funds going to Israeli companies or universities, research centers, and so on. So there's a lot of money and support going there, just materially, economically, militarily. It's incredible that this is still ongoing. You cannot imagine another country where Europe would do this. I mean, it might happen, but it wouldn't happen this openly and this brazenly, right? It's even a violation of the European own position. There was a common position of all European countries, 2008, saying we should not give or supply weapons or sell weapons to countries where these weapons might be used for human rights violations. Now, I think whatever you think about what's going on in Palestine, even if you're only vaguely aware that something is happening there, I think no one could argue today that there's not at least a risk of it being used for human rights violations. So the European Union is even violating its own principles in order to support and sustain the Israeli genocidal war. Now, secondly, there's a normalization. I think this is really important. When a school is bombed in Ukraine, and this is horrible, of course, when it happens, it gets a lot of attention, and rightly so, because it shouldn't happen. But when Palestinian schools, hospitals, journalists are assassinated, executed, sometimes at really a point-blank range, this is downplayed. It's like Palestinians are not even considered full humans by the EU establishment. It's very, very violent. And then you have the normalization of Israel as if it was a normal state. For example, Israel is still a partner in the research and development programs of the European Union, while Russia was immediately suspended after its invasion of Ukraine. The Eurovision Song Festival, which is basically a festival where a lot of European and also countries that are not member of the European Union, but European countries send a singer or a band or whatever, and they sing, and the best one wins, or supposedly the best one wins. Now, Israel is allowed to participate in this. This is pure normalization. Russia was excluded from it. And you have a number of these examples, European football competitions, and so on and so on. So both materially, militarily, as I would say on a more propagandistic, ideological level, you can see that this is also a project that the European establishment, European countries have been actively supporting. There are no sanctions today against Israel. You cannot imagine. You cannot imagine today that not. And Europe doesn't have a normal relationship with Israel. Europe has Israel has privileged access to the EU market. So you can't even say that we just continued normal relations. it's privileged relations. So yes, we've been calling out this complicity systematically. European Parliament, for example, last time refused to even debate Gaza. Like you're in the third month of a complete crackdown, no humanitarian aid, hunger, famine, genocide. And the European Parliament says, no, let's only speak about Ukraine. So of course we need to call that out and we need to mobilize. And there's tens and thousands of people throughout Europe that mobilize in the streets. So that's really, really important. Do they condemn, because that was the second, do they get a lot of repression?
Well, free
Yes.
speech, it's free speech under attack, basically, in Europe over this issue.
Absolutely. You've seen it in Germany. Like Germany was a front runner, I think, arguably in this, where, local activists have been arrested, where even the wrong tweet could warrant a police visit, where even European politicians at some point were refused entry because they were going to speak about Palestine. So it's very worrying. You've seen it in France. In France, members of parliament have been accused of apologizing terrorism because they stood up for Palestinian rights. In Belgium as well, in Brussels as well, we see these tendencies. I'm not going to compare to what's happening in the US because I've seen some images. It's people disappearing on the streets. It's absolutely worrying, or people getting stopped at the border for their opinions. But yeah, there is a crackdown, and of course, it's also a tactic to avoid discussing the topic. Like you're vilifying the other, you're basically labeling him in order not to speak about what's really ongoing there. If you're against killing Palestinian children, if you're against executing Palestinian journalists, you must be anti-Semitic. That's a way of killing the debate. But I'm very encouraged by what I see also from a lot of young people in Europe. There's a lot of young people mobilizing, and also a lot of Jewish organizations, by the way, because people are saying, no, but you're anti-Semitic. No, a lot of Jewish organizations, I know in the US that's the case, but also in Europe, they're marching, they're mobilizing for Palestine. And that's amazing because it shows that this is about international law, about basic human rights. And it's not at all what they're trying to make it. And so I think that there's hope, but indeed the repression, by the way, it's increasing against all social movements. Like also, like our government in Belgium is now attempting again to put on the agenda an anti-demonstration law, also for social protests and so on. So you can see that as their policies become less popular, you can see that there's this authoritarian tendency of saying we need to crack down on protests. We need to control the protests, not just the narrative through the media, what they try, but also the protests, the people that are actually resisting the policies. It's extremely troublesome.
Well, let's talk about Belgium for a moment. You are a part of the Workers Party in Belgium. Belgium is also seeing this kind of dangerous shift to the far right, but you do have a vibrant left as well that you're a part of. So can you explain to our audience, because I think when we talk about Europe, Europe isn't one country. You have all of these countries in the European Union that have their own parliaments, their own politics, their own political parties, and sort of their own dynamics at play. So what's happening in Germany is not necessarily what's happening in Belgium, is certainly not what's happening in Greece. But with regard to Belgium, could you explain to our audience what is driving this sort of rise of the far right that we are seeing in a lot of parts of the world? And how is your party, the Workers' Party, responding to that?
Well, I think it's interesting because there's a number. It's true what you say. Obviously, it's different countries, different political realities, but there are some common points. Like the rise of the far right is something that you see in a number of countries throughout Europe. It's not just one country or the other. It's something which is, and there's. It's difficult to generalize, but I'm going to try to give a general idea anyway. There's a lot of anger and frustration amongst the people in Europe for many reasons, and often right reasons. Like, there's this decline of Europe, but there's the decline of social conditions as well. Like many people feel that they will live a worse life than their parents had, that they have less chances now. In Belgium, for example, we've had very unpopular measures over the last years where you got, salaries blocked, like a refusal to increase salaries, for example. You got the cut downs on social services, like because they say, for example, now we spoke about militarization. The European Union suddenly found or is looking for 800 billion euros to put into arms, into weapons, into war. But for over a decade, they've told us there's no money. Like there's no money, you need to cut down on pensions, you need to cut down on healthcare, you need to cut down on education, you need to cut down on public transport. So, we see that people see that the services, their wages, the cost of living, that all of that is worsening. Like they feel, I go to the supermarket, I get less for the same money than I got a few years ago. So my energy bills are exploding. And so what the far right does is channel that anger towards those that are not responsible, but that are even in a more vulnerable position. Be it migrants, be it Muslims, be it LGBTQI people. I mean, it's like they're trying to channel it to different groups in order to make sure that we do not touch those really responsible. Because who's really responsible? Obviously, I mean, you have got the governments, but they're acting on behalf of the big multinational companies, corporations, and the billionaires. We've seen an increase in the number of millionaires and billionaires in Europe. Now, that money is taken from somewhere and from someone. The money they are channeling to shareholders, the money they are channeling to their own pockets, it's not going into our, productive economy. It's not going into our public services. It's not going to wages. So, and this is very clear. If you look like the last 10, 20, 30 years, the productivity gains in European industry, European production, have not gone to the working class. They've gone elsewhere. They've gone to the rich. So the far right is playing on this, protecting the ultra rich, and saying, "Hey, why don't you blame the Muslims for what's wrong? If you don't find a job, it's probably the fault of some kind of immigrant." No, it's not. The problem is that there's no investment in, for example, housing, public housing, so that everyone can get a house. And why is it not? Because you don't want to tax the rich. Why is there no investment in schools? Why are we packed in small classrooms? Why is why do you have to wait for I don't know how long to get an appointment in a hospital for healthcare? All of these things, they're not coincidences. They're consequences of very practical policies. And so the far right tries to channel that, to protect basically the system by channeling it towards downwards, basically. And our challenge is to say, no, this anger about our public service, it is right, but let's put the blame where it belongs, on the system, on capitalism, and on those today benefiting from that system.
I mean, really, it's like the same cookie cutter story everywhere, isn't it? And so if the right's doing something similar around the world, it's working for them, and perhaps the left should start looking to each other on what's working to combat that. But since we're on the subject of the left, and particularly the European left, I want you to explain to our audience, which is mostly American, can you kind of define what is the European left when we talk about that? I know it's a really, really big question. It's probably hard to generalize because it's different by country. But, you have spoken about how some left parties in Europe have drifted towards militarism, especially in the Nordic countries. And then, and maybe here I'm talking more about like actually established political parties and not necessarily like left movements and groups. But I guess, could you kind of like break down that general network of leftism across Europe for our audience, and why is it that some people on the left in Europe seem to be so pro-NATO? Like, I think that's what's really confusing for a lot of American leftists to try to grasp. And in that vein, and I always ask like 5 questions in one. So if you could kind of explain what the European left is, why some of their politics are a bit odd on certain subjects, especially with regard to militarism, and what do you think has gone wrong there? Why is that the case?
That's indeed a very broad question. So no,
try to answer it, Marc, without getting yourself in trouble.
No, I'm good. I can answer it. I just try. Let me just try to see if I can, because indeed the political system is very different. So we have in many countries different parties that claim to be on the left, rightly so, wrongly so. That I don't want to go into that right now. But it's not like it's divided mostly amongst Democrats and Republicans like it would be in the US. So broadly, if we speak about the left in Europe, that'd be in every country, mostly 3 parties that would be considered to be on the left or progressive. Should be the Social Democrats, sometimes called the Labour Party. Then there would be the Green Party, Green parties country by country. And then there would be, let's say, what some people call the radical left, I would call them the authentic left, but all right, that's a matter of debate. But so, and the position, for example, internationally of these parties has not always been similar. Like World War I, for example, this was before the radical left, the authentic left, or the communist parties, where most communist parties were even established. So this was the main workers' parties were these social democratic parties, socialist parties at the time. During World War I, many of them in Europe, the majority, they chose to support the war credits. So they went into that direction. So it was a battle. People within those parties did not agree. Then from that came also the divide. In many of these parties, where some people said, no, we're not going to march for our own bourgeoisie, because there's this saying of, you think you're going to die for your country, but in reality, you're going to die for its multinationals. And so it wasn't self-evident at the time during World War I that everyone that defined itself on the left, especially the leadership, leadership basically betrayed the desire of people for peace at the time. Also during the anti-colonial struggle, the struggle for liberation of many colonial countries, it was not the case that the social democratic parties in Europe all supported the struggle of decolonization, of freedom, or the national liberation struggles at the time. That's not the case. Looking at France and Algeria, for example, at the time, the predecessor of what's now the Socialist Party was not at all in favor of saying, hey, this is a wonderful struggle, let's support it. So there's, how would I say, there's a degree of continuity. And today we've seen, for example, the Green parties, they come in part from the fact that they want, more environmentally friendly policies, but in part also from the peace movement of the 80s against missiles and so on. Now, some of these parties have become the most militaristic parties on the continent, like the German Green Party. They sometimes outdo the right wing. They say no.
If you enjoyed this episode and want to hear the rest, you can access it by becoming a Breakthrough News member at patreon.com/breakthroughnews.